I still remember the evening when I found an old cardboard box while helping my parents clean out a storage room that had not been opened in years. Dust floated through the air every time I lifted another stack of forgotten magazines, and the smell of old paper filled the room in a way that instantly carried me backward without warning. Buried beneath faded notebooks and cracked photo albums was a bundle of handwritten letters tied together with a piece of string that had turned almost yellow with age. I sat on the floor, opened the first envelope carefully, and realized it was a letter my mother had written to a relative decades before. The handwriting leaned slightly to the right. Certain words had been crossed out and rewritten, and there were tiny stains where the ink had blurred, as if someone's hand had rested there too long. I spent nearly an hour reading pages that described completely ordinary days, yet I felt more connected to those moments than I often did scrolling through hundreds of digital messages on my phone. That night, I could not stop thinking about how something so simple had survived the years, carrying not just information, but emotion, patience, and presence. At the time, my own life looked efficient by every modern standard. I woke to alarms on my phone, answered messages before leaving bed, listened to podcasts while brushing my teeth, and ordered groceries, transportation, and meals with a few taps on a screen. Every question had an immediate answer. Every song was available instantly, and every photograph was captured in perfect color and resolution. Yet despite all that convenience, weeks blurred together so completely that I sometimes struggled to remember what I had actually done the previous weekend. I had thousands of pictures stored in the cloud, but very few memories that seemed to settle deeply enough to revisit without opening an app. A few days after finding those letters, I visited an older family friend who still insisted on making coffee with a metal filter instead of using modern machines. I offered to help speed things up, but he simply smiled and told me to sit. The coffee dripped one slow drop at a time into a glass beneath the filter, while we watched the morning light move across the table. At first the silence made me restless. My hand reached for my phone almost automatically, before I remembered I had left it in my pocket. Eventually, we started talking about small things: childhood meals, broken bicycles, rainy seasons, forgotten songs on the radio, and neighbors who always seemed to know everyone's business. By the time the coffee was ready, nearly 20 minutes had passed, yet I realized the conversation had unfolded naturally because nothing was rushing us toward the next task. I walked home, thinking less about the taste of the coffee than about the waiting that had somehow become part of its flavor. Around the same period, I volunteered to help clear out belongings from the home of an elderly couple who were moving into a smaller apartment. Among the furniture and kitchen utensils sat a bulky black and white television that no longer worked. I joked that children today would probably refuse to watch anything without high-definition color, and the old man laughed before telling me stories about entire neighborhoods gathering around one similar television when he was young. He described children squeezing together on the floor, adults bringing folding stools from home, someone climbing onto the roof to adjust the antenna whenever the picture disappeared, and everyone cheering the moment the image returned. He remembered heroes wearing brilliant costumes, even though the screen itself showed only shades of gray. I found that detail strangely moving because I realized the colors had existed mostly in memory and imagination. The machine had offered only fragments, and people themselves had completed the experience. A few weeks later, I attended a birthday dinner with several friends. We met at a busy restaurant where every table seemed occupied by people staring into glowing screens between conversations. At our own table, someone suggested we place our phones face down for the meal, as a small experiment. Everyone laughed, but we agreed. The first 10 minutes felt awkward. Without notifications to interrupt us, pauses appeared naturally in the conversation, and no one seemed quite sure what to do with them. Then, stories emerged that might otherwise have disappeared beneath constant distraction. One friend admitted he had been feeling overwhelmed at work, despite looking successful from the outside. Another confessed she missed writing in a journal, but always convinced herself she had no time. Someone else remembered childhood summers spent waiting beside the mailbox for postcards from relatives traveling overseas. We stayed at the restaurant long after finishing dessert, not because the food was extraordinary, but because none of us felt pulled somewhere else by a vibrating device. Walking home afterward, I realized I could remember every face around that table clearly, while dinners from only a month earlier had already faded into a blur of receipts and photographs. The realization unsettled me enough that I began paying attention to my own habits. I noticed how often I filled every empty minute by unlocking my phone without purpose. Waiting in line became an opportunity to scroll. Riding the elevator meant checking headlines I would forget within an hour. Even standing at a traffic light invited another glance at endless updates from people I barely knew. There was never any silence left untouched, never any gap that remained empty long enough for a thought or memory to settle. Curious whether changing that pattern would make any difference, I made a private decision not to eliminate technology, but to leave small pockets of my day unfilled. During breakfast, I sat by the window without listening to anything. On walks, I kept my phone in my pocket unless someone actually called. I stopped taking photographs of every pleasant scene, and instead tried to stand still for a few extra seconds. At first, those moments felt almost uncomfortable, as though I had forgotten something important. Then, they slowly became the parts of the day I anticipated most. One rainy afternoon, the power went out across my neighborhood. With no internet and no television, the apartment became unusually quiet, except for rain tapping against the windows. I lit a candle more for atmosphere than necessity, and found myself rereading one of the handwritten letters from the box I had discovered earlier. After a while, there was a knock at the door. A neighbor from down the hall had also lost electricity, and wondered if I wanted to share the snacks she had been unable to refrigerate. We spent 2 hours talking in near darkness while listening to the storm. We spoke about childhood games, grandparents, favorite teachers, embarrassing mistakes, and recipes that never turned out the same twice. When the lights finally flickered back on, neither of us rushed to turn on the television. The silence had already done something that constant entertainment rarely achieved. Months passed, and although my daily routine still involved deadlines, online meetings, and instant communication, I noticed a subtle shift in what remained with me afterward. The memories that lingered were rarely the perfectly documented ones. Instead, they were the incomplete moments that required my attention. The smell of old paper in a forgotten box, the slow rhythm of coffee dripping into a glass, the static-filled stories about crowded evenings around a black-and-white television, the pauses during dinner when nobody reached for a phone, the unexpected conversation by candlelight while rain covered the windows. None of those experiences were spectacular, and none would have attracted much attention online, yet they stayed with me because there had been room for them to breathe. The final lesson arrived unexpectedly when I decided to write an actual letter to an old friend instead of sending another instant message. I spent far longer choosing my words than I ever would have in a text. After sealing the envelope and dropping it into a mailbox, there was nothing left to do except wait. Days passed without response, and I occasionally wondered whether it had arrived at all. Then one afternoon an envelope appeared in my own mailbox, with my name written across the front. I carried it inside almost ceremonially, sat at the kitchen table, and opened it slowly. The reply was not especially dramatic. It contained stories about work, family meals, a broken bicycle, a recent illness that had thankfully passed, and memories we both laughed about years later. Yet reading those pages felt different from reading messages that disappear beneath dozens of newer ones within hours. The waiting had quietly changed the value of the exchange. Looking back now, I do not believe the past was automatically better simply because it lacked convenience. I appreciate instant communication when someone needs help, reliable technology when work depends on it, and easy access to information that once would have taken days to find. But I also know that the richest memories in my own life rarely formed when everything arrived immediately and perfectly complete. They appeared when something remained unfinished long enough for my attention to enter, when silence was allowed to exist without being erased, when waiting transformed ordinary moments into meaningful ones, and when absence gave appreciation the space to grow. Whenever I catch myself racing from one notification to another, or documenting an experience before I have actually lived it, I think back to that dusty storage room and the bundle of letters tied with fading string. I remember the slow coffee, the gray television that somehow held brilliant colors in memory, the conversations that deepened because no one interrupted them, and the rain-soaked evening when a power outage unexpectedly made two neighbors into friends. Those moments remind me that what lasts is not always what is most vivid or most immediate, but often what is given enough quiet space to settle gently into the heart until, without realizing it, it becomes part of who we are.